Good morning to everyone. We are here for the last plenary session of our meeting, and I'm very grateful to the organizational staff for the invitation as a chair, and we will listen to two different speeches. The first one is from Professor Ruth Muller from University of Munich, and Professor Muller will be introduced by Assunta Villaniti from the University of Rome. Of course, I am Orazio Giancola from the University of Rome, and Assunta will be the presenter of our first keynote. So I give the floor to Assunta for a very brief presentation, and after we will listen to the presentation of Ruth Muller. Assunta.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure and an honor for me to present you Ruth Muller, Professor of Science and Technology Policy at the School of Social Science and Technology, Department of STS at the Technical University of Munich. And she worked in the interdisciplinary fields on science and technology studies. Her work explore the nexus of science, technology, society, and policy, focusing particularly on how institutional norms and values shape scientific knowledge production practice, on emergent knowledge cultures in the life science and biomedicine, and on the circulation and interpretation of biomedical knowledge and biotechnology, society, and policy. Across all activities, she emphasized questions of social justice and equity, both regarding participation in scientific institutions and the impact of the innovation on diverse groups in society. The focus of her research is plural. The issues of particular interest during the last years are academic knowledge, culture and transformation, emerging knowledge cultures, life science, gender diversity, and social justice. Our research and publication in recent years look at how the human environment and lifestyles can influence genetics. The title of the intervention of Professor Muller is Adverse Childhood Experiences, a site for novel encounters between biological research and educational justice. Ruth, the floor is yours for 40 minutes, and after that, we have time for some discussion or questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Assunta, and for this very, very warm welcome. I'm really excited to be here today to present my work. Can you hear me okay? Yes. I'm going to talk today about adverse childhood experiences, a concept that has emerged in biomedical research over the last roughly 25 years. And how knowledge production in biology has been used in educational settings to make arguments for institutional change in schools, to better accommodate children who have experienced adversity, trauma, and other stressful living conditions in early life. So that's where I'm going to be going. I briefly want to, before I get started, say just a few words about the research field that I come from. I'm a researcher in science and technology studies. Not everyone might be familiar with this field. Its abbreviation is STS. And so we are a research field in the social sciences that looks specifically at the relationship between science, scientific knowledge, technological innovation, and society. And we do that in a two-way kind of mode. On the one hand, we're interested in how social context shapes knowledge production and technological innovation. And social context here can mean the economic, political, social climate in a society, but it can also mean very practical things like how do we fund science? How do we incentivize academic careers? And all of these different factors shape in the end what kind of research questions become asked, what kind of technologies are being developed. So that's the one direction. And then the other aspect is, of course, how does new knowledge and new technologies, how do they shape society? How is this knowledge taken up in society? How does this circulate? What kind of social, ethical, political impact does it have in society? And my background is, I originally studied molecular biology, and worked myself in breast cancer research for a while. And then I stumbled across STS and was just basically mind blown. This is super, this is really exciting. And I gradually migrated into the social sciences, did a PhD in the sociology of science. And so that's where my focus also on this question of biological biomedical knowledge in society comes from. So for today's talk, I will start with talking about what this adverse childhood experiences concept is, where it comes from. I will say a few things about why I think that it's receiving increasing attention at the moment, which of course has societal causes, but also some causes which, that lie in the way in which biology has begun to articulate this concept epistemically. And then I will introduce a case study. This is the title of the paper that is behind the presentation, which I wrote together with Martha Kenny from San Francisco State University. It's called Science of Hope, ACEs, Trauma-Informed Care, and Race Restorative Justice. And this is the specific case study where we look at actors in education, and partially also juvenile corrections, who have used biological knowledge around the ACEs concept to argue for institutional change in their school district. So that's kind of the structure of the talk. So let's dive right in. What are ACEs? Where does this adverse childhood experiences concept come from? Of course, in different social science and medical disciplines, we know for a long time that adversity in early life can shape health trajectories, can shape mental well-being over a long course. But this specific concept of adverse childhood experiences was coined in a study in 1998. It was a large epidemiological study that was conducted together by the US Center for Disease Control with Kaiser, which is a huge insurance carrier in the US. And what they did is they surveyed 17,000 people in the US and asked them about negative experiences in their childhood and assessed based on insurance records and on examinations their current health status in middle age, basically. And what they found is that adverse experiences in early life have a strong correlation with ill mental and physical health in later life. Now we're all going to say, not super surprising, but it's different to show it on a proper epidemiological data set. And they then articulated this concept of ACEs and argued that there is a graded relationship between the number of adverse childhood experiences and this whole set of literature at this point. How do you count adverse childhood experiences? That's not, So, but they are, as epidemiologists and based on their materials, they argue that there is a kind of dose-response relationship to more negative experiences in early life. The higher the likelihood for a full range of different physical and mental health conditions in later life. What they define as, they had a very narrow set of experiences that they defined as adverse childhood experiences. Again, another whole literature that criticizes this and argues particularly for the inclusion of more structural violence in, like racism, social discrimination, experience of poverty as such, into the ACEs categories. But these are the 10 ACEs that these researchers defined in the late 90s: abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, neglect, physical, emotional, household dysfunction, mental illness in the family, incarceration in the family, violence against the mother. Here it's assumed that only mothers can be victims of violence in the family, substance abuse, and divorce in the family. You can see, of course, that these are all very different experiences, right? In the adverse childhood experiences concept, as it is articulated at this point, they're all just counted as 1, 2, 3, 4. And they argued that this dose-response correlation can affect behavior later in life, but also can have very concrete physical and mental health outcomes, ranging from diabetes to heart disease and so on. Now, this is this graded dose-response relationship. Now, this concept has been published in the late 90s, but we see that this is the publications that cite ACEs since its inception. We see a very strong spike, and this spike would continue going up if we had more bibliometric analysis. We see a peak really emerging in the late 2010s. And with Martha Kenny, I've written another article about why we think that is. I'm only going to briefly reference this in this context. So we have this uptake in scientific attention, but then also at a similar time we have starting an uptake of the concept in terms of public attention. These are two publications that came out in the late 2010s. Nadine Burke-Harris was the first Children's Health Commissioner of California. She published a book, The Deepest Well, which is exactly about the ACEs concept and how it affects long-term mental and physical health. Paper Tiger is a very interesting documentary movie about a school, and the schools are starting to come in Walla Walla, Washington in the United States, where a school used kind of ACEs-based research to say, okay, what can we do for those children that have already experienced a lot of trauma when they come into our schools to change the school setting. And kind of these types of behaviors are what we will see in the case study that I will show you later. So we have this emerging public attention, we have this uptick in scientific attention. Now, with Martha Kenny, I make an argument that this is due, among other things, to a change in how the biological mechanisms for basically how ACEs work, how do they affect the body in ways that create later life, specifically later life physical and mental health outcomes, that has shifted, and that is different scientific explanations, basically the different epistemic underpinnings of what's going on with ACEs in the body, also shape different ways of thinking about possibilities for preventing and remediating. And remediating is a very important point here, the effects of ACEs. So I'm not going to go into detail into this, basically the overview of this article that really looks into the epistemic history of the ACEs concept. But if we look at the explanatory frameworks, how they developed over time, we have a first phase where basically the explanation is exclusively psychological. So the idea is some psychological trauma that is not further defined in any material sense, that leads to ongoing psychological distress, and the people who have experienced ACEs will engage in so-called coping behaviors, so they will be more likely to engage in smoking and drinking, in other risk behaviors, and this is why they have worse later life health. So it's kind of mediation through coping behaviors. Around 2005, we start to have the first sense that maybe ACEs did, so the adversity in childhood did something to the body itself, so we start to see an emergence of material biological explanations that has shifted something in the body, which set people on a trajectory towards worse health in later life. And this is the allostatic load model concept, quite complicated concept. And what's important here to note is that the way this model is expressed is that basically the body can bounce back a couple of times from negative experience, so it's resilient up to a point. But if too much stress happens in early life, something kind of breaks and is fixed in a different direction. So it has this kind of non-reversible damage concept, the allostatic load model. And then with 2014, roughly, we arrived at epigenetic explanations. And I'll say something about what epigenetics is just in a second. But epigenetics is a concept of material inscription in the body through changes on the DNA, but a reversible concept. And this is the important shift that we see between phase 2 and phase 3. With epigenetics, we get this idea of plasticity, reversibility. So it's in the body, it's no longer only under apostrophe psychological. There is an idea of a biological mark, but often marked it is reversible plastic. So, and I'm just going to say a few words about what epigenetics is. So, all of you have different cells in your body, right? But each of these cells has the same genome. So if we would sequence the genome of your skin cell and your liver cell, they would have the same genome. How is it then that the skin cell looks completely different than a liver cell? And this is where epigenetics comes in. So epigenetics, if you imagine, like there's a long strand of the DNA, and then epigenetics are small modifications, chemical modifications on the DNA that tell the cell how to read the genome. So basically it's the bookmarks in the so-called book of life that then switch on liver cell specific genes in the liver cell, switch on skin cell specific cells in the liver cell, and switch other genes off, right? So that from the same DNA you can have a very different result in the body. So that's kind of the basic function of epigenetics in the body. Pretty essential, otherwise we would be a blob of the same cell. In the last, roughly, I would say 20 years, a subfield of epigenetics has emerged. It's called environmental epigenetics. Because researchers found that epigenetic modifications on the DNA can respond to environmental stimulus. For example, toxins can change how, let's say in the liver cell, they might be switching off some enzyme that we really need for detoxifying something, right? So different environmental stimuli, might be toxins, might be nutrition, and might also be social experiences, can shift this reading out the genome, basically, increasing, decreasing, stopping, or initiating gene expression. And these changes, again, can affect health and illness in later life. And what's important here, again, is that with epigenetics, we have this focus on early life. So if some people are exposed to a toxin, for example, in early life, that can have a bigger impact on the trajectory of the body than when it happens in later life. But we also have this notion of reversibility. We don't know if these marks stay, if they go away by itself again, or if there's other environmental experiences that can change these epigenetic marks again. And that's a really important aspect here, why epigenetics creates such a different story around ACEs than prior biological models. So, yeah, and I'm giving you a quote here from interesting McEwen. He was actually the father of the allostatic load concept, and shortly before he died, he really jumped on the epigenetic train. This is an epigenetic phrasing of how you can think about ACEs, and then it's what becomes its opposite in this narrative of resilience. The healthy brain has a considerable capacity for resilience based upon its ability to respond to interventions designed to open windows of plasticity and redirect its function towards better health. So, and I'm giving you this quote because this is exactly the version of ACEs that becomes so popular, or starts to become very popular in the late 2010s, early 2020s. And it's a much, like I can explain to you epigenetics on a superficial level relatively quickly, much more complicated if I would try to explain the allostatic load model to you, much more chemical, different processes, but epigenetics becomes kind of this catch-all epigenetic model to understand how the environment can affect gene expression, but also becomes this reversible responsive layer on the genome where we can make interventions. And this is the model of ACEs basically that we find in this uptick in publications as well as in these first iterations where this concept is brought to a wider public and to different actors. And yeah, and in this first article we argue basically that it's this due to this possibility of reversibility that allows now for different actors to latch onto the ACEs concept and actually make it fruitful for arguing for change in institutional settings. Okay, so I'm now going to switch to the case study, and now we're going to get to education in a much more focused manner. So I'm just going to tell you very quickly how we got to do this study. This was kind of a very personal situation that led me to this study. I have a friend who works in a restorative justice organization in the Pacific Northwest. I'm going to say more about restorative justice also in just a moment. And we talked about her work with kind of this mediation practices in different settings. And then she just says this line during the phone call, you know, we have so many children whose brains are just wired differently from trauma. They just need different care. And I, as a kind of scholar of, you know, biomedicine and society, was like, can you say more about this? What does it mean? And then we became basically aware that there are training programs in her region that are gradually growing, also in different parts of the US, that call themselves the neuroscience trainings. Neuroscience, epigenetics, ACEs, and resilience. Those are the 4 letters of the neuroscience trainings. And we became really interested in this. How is it that someone in a restorative justice organization suddenly talks about brains being wired differently and different kinds of care being needed for these children? So we did field work in this region in the Pacific Northwest in 2 neighboring school districts. We interviewed teachers, principals, restorative justice facilitators, and also professionals in juvenile justice, who were all part of the transformation in this school district based on what they had learned in these neuroscience trainings. We also did participant observation at these trainings and different implementation meetings where different organizations met, talked about how to implement this knowledge from the neuroscience trainings. And I also, as part of the field work, underwent training in restorative justice myself. So we have these different bits of typical social science, ethnographic, interview-based field work. So what did we find? So first of all, I want to say something about these neuroscience trainings. So this is a typical announcement for one of these trainings that are offered in this region and in other regions of the US at this point. Of the neurosciences. You have the acronym neurobiology, epigenetics, ACEs, and resilience. And what's particularly important here is that they're introducing the ACE study, but they're also always framing the content of the trainings as going beyond the ACEs. So beyond focusing on the damage that diversity can do towards this notion of what can we do. I'll read this from the abstract. This training explores how life experience impact our biological nervous system. It takes a deeper dive into the ACE study and how to interpret the results, to find best fit practices to increase core protective factors and capacity building, increase attachment. So it's about kind of how can we read something like the ACE study and then think about how we can respond to it in different settings. And these trainings are aimed at people who work with children, youth, and young adults. So that's their core group of people they try to attract. They are offered for free. So the NGO in that area that offers these neuroscience trainings, they hold them, and you can call them and basically say, I want you to come to my school and do this training, and they will come and do it for free. And they were kind of telling us they were have trainings with 5 people, they have training with 250 people. It's kind of just a really non-profit in the sense of dispersing this knowledge. So they seek to create this first step, this understanding of how ACEs can impact neurological development and can lead, and this is the point where we get into the educational setting, so generally more widely the work with children, how this kind of impact can lead to difficult behaviors in children and youth. It then promotes trauma-informed approaches to working with children and youth in order to serve children, all children, but specifically children with ACEs better and not further traumatize them through, for example, punitive justice. And they argue, and this is the key point, based on this epigenetic notion of ACEs, that change is always possible as biology is plastic, and that biological change is possible through positive social relations. So they make an argument from biology, but then say that the main way to approach this would not be medication, or that could be part of it in severe cases, but that the main part is working with social relations in institutions that work with children. So I'm going to walk you through like a typical narrative that structures these trainings. So if you were sitting in a training, this is kind of the narrative you would be sent home with. So first step, adversity affects the body on the molecular level. When a child feels threatened, many hormonal and neurological pathways are activated. Second, if the stress response is triggered often, these pathways become permanently activated. That's kind of the inheritance of the allostatic load model. Children learn to expect threats, and become hypervigilant. And this hypervigilance is not seen as something just psychological, but through a different biochemical process in the body. This can lead to a situation where they can sometimes respond to neutral stimuli as if to a threat, for example, in a school setting, which may lead to disruptive behaviors or behaviors that are seen as disruptive in a school setting and in other settings where professionals interact with children. Can lead to a lack of focus because they're scanning their environment constantly for threats, and other issues that can make it harder for children to succeed in schools. Due to the biological embodiment of their experiences, children and youth often have little control over their behaviors. That's a very important argument that is being brought forward in these trainings. If we respond to these behaviors with punishment, this just adds another layer of trauma for the children, rather than helping them change their behavior. And this is why at the end of the neuroscience trainings, the argument is always that new approaches to disruptive behaviors based on both building relations are needed to help children make biosocial change that helps them succeed in life. And these changes are framed as trauma-informed care, and a lot of the methods how to achieve trauma-informed care in this specific setting comes from restorative justice. So briefly, as a definition, how is trauma-informed care defined? It is defined as applying an understanding of, and here I quote, how violence, victimization, and other traumatic experiences have impacted the lives of the individuals involved. And it should lead to the design of systems and provisions of services so that they accommodate trauma survivors' needs and are consonant with healing and recovery. So a consideration of how an experience of trauma reshapes individuals' experiences of the world, and hence needs to be considered when we interact with these individuals, or many individuals, in different institutional settings. Restorative justice, which is in the specific story I tell about, a very important element, is a community-based and trauma-informed practice used to build relationships. It's very relationship-focused, strengthen communities, encourage accountability, repair harm, and restore relationships when wrongdoing occurs. So, restorative justice professionals that I interacted with always said, like, in punitive justice, classical discipline-based justice, the question is which rule has been broken and what is the appropriate punishment, while in restorative justice, the question is what harm has occurred and how can this harm be repaired and who needs to be accountable. So it strongly focused also on kind of mediation between perpetrators and victims, and focusing on identifying harm, needs and obligations that arise from this harm, and accountability in terms of making a plan to repair the harm and put things as right as possible. And in the US context, and I think this becomes more and more a topic also for us in Europe, restorative justice comes strongly out of the context to remedy what is called the school-to-prison pipeline that affects particularly Black children and youth and other minoritized groups. So the school-to-prison pipeline basically means that Black children in the US are much more affected by forms of punishment in school. So for the same offense, Black children are much more likely to be suspended or expelled, which then again increases their chances of incarceration later in life. And restorative justice is an attempt also to say what other forms of justice can be practiced in schools so that we counteract the school-to-prison pipeline. And I think we have that more and more in Europe, also with other minoritized groups. So I will now take my remaining just a bit more than 15 minutes to talk specifically about this case. So how did people in this field set use these kinds of knowledges that they encountered in the neuroscience trainings? So at our field site in the Pacific Northwest, they were drawn on the neuroscience trainings to support institutional change in education. I think the institutional is here really important. They were interested not necessarily in what can the children do better, but what can the institutions do better. And therefore it is important, I want to be very clear about one thing here. So even if the epigenetic paradigm in ACEs research allows us to think about reversibility, about plasticity. There is still a lot of publications that come out of biology that are very deterministic, right? Something happened to mouse X, and now mouse X will be aggressive and stressed her whole life. So a lot of narratives from biology can be very deterministic and then lend themselves very easily to stigmatization, to discrimination, to othering people who have had negative experiences. And we know that from the eugenic past and present of many societies. What's interesting is that these neuroscience trainings insist so strongly on combining these kind of biological knowledge claims with knowledge from psychology, pedagogy, and other social science fields that have shown how change is possible, that develop what we call a narrative choreography that ends with very specific, it draws on the power of kind of the natural sciences, but then ends with very clear propositions for social action that can be implemented with relatively little resources in concrete settings. And what this narrative choreography helps to build is a common new language for the actors at our field set for how to think about the challenges in working with children and youth. Many of the people were just also very, at the end of their reason how to work with growing difficult children in schools. It offered reframing of disruptive behaviors as rooted in biosocial experiences of diversity, rather than disrespect, malice, kind of personal attacks. It shifted the responsibility for change from the children to the institutions, and it inspired concrete new institutional practices aimed at offering biosocial remediation and healing. And what did that mean concretely? So I'm going to work with quotes now. So when we did all these interviews with different actors in the region, and one thing was that there was kind of an origin story, how many of the actors in education came to interact with this neuroscience knowledge. And that was because they had a very high teen suicide rate in their district. So I'm going to quote here one of the actual people who became a part of this neuroscience organization. We have a very high teen suicide rate here. The school district, the reason they became motivated for trauma-informed practices was that they had 2 high school students in the same year commit suicide. It's a small school, right? The then superintendent was just devastated, and she goes to her school board and says, we have 2 kids kill themselves. We've got to do things differently. They didn't know what to do differently, but she and her district became kind of this learning community. And in this moment where they're trying to figure out how to do things differently, they started encountering these neuroscience trainings. The neuroscience trainings then helped them reframe everyday experiences that they had with children, not only big events like suicide, but like everyday challenges. So this is from a principal in an elementary school. He says, we just saw more kindergartners coming in with real challenges as far as regulating their emotions, connecting socially, and being able to be in the classroom environment, ready to learn. We saw much more runners who were just running out of the classroom, running out of the school, throwing chairs, throwing books, that sort of stuff. And to tell you the truth, we just didn't feel we were meeting their needs. Like something's wrong, because we're not cracking the code. We don't know what it is that is setting off these students. So we took that on as a kind of personal journey, personal commitment, community commitment to say, how can we serve this student? So that was kind of the starting point where the people started to engage with this neuroscience knowledge. And then we see how they take this knowledge, that is then, so I should say, what the school district then did is that they actually developed a training module. So they went to the neuroscience organization and said, hey, many of us have set on your trainings. We think this is really important for our schools. And it has to be noted as well that schools in the US, of course, have much more freedom how they plan their curriculum. Like, I'm located at a German university, there's not a lot of freedom in school curricula there. But in the US, with all its problems, that is one of the benefits, that there is more freedom how to approach a curriculum. And so they set up a 9-module training program for everyone in the school district. And this is a very interesting aspect. They said, okay, if we want to do this trauma-informed neuroscience approach, we need to train everyone. So they invited the school cook, the bus driver, everyone, the whole community was part of these training programs, and had 9 modules, basically where they went from what are ACEs, Why is that relevant for us here in schools? Towards what does trauma-informed care mean? What are restorative justice principles? And they did that over a year. And then they started kind of implementing, seeing how they can implement that in everyday work. And I will say something about the new practices in a moment, but a lot of it was that people started to reframe the difficult behaviors that they were encountering in their everyday work. And this is kind of one of the quotes. This is from a middle school assistant principal. I've always been an empathetic person, but now I'm thinking about how ACEs have impacted the executive functions of the brain. Like the kid this morning that's worried about his incarcerated mother. You know he's having anxiety attacks. He's showing all the signs of that kind of fight or flight moment because he's had to flight a lot with his leg. Yeah, I guess that's how I've integrated the understanding of the brain development and the executive function with what's actually happening with the kids. So it's these kind of moments of reframing. So this kid is not just behaving badly, but kind of what's going on actually, and how might that show up in behavior. These are two other quotes that go into this direction. I think what was relevant and important in the neuroscience trainings was that there was science behind it. There's a reason why the student is acting out. There's a reason why this part of the brain has not been fully developed. And of course, those are also all somewhat lay interpretations about the science, but it's quite important that there's this reframe as not only disrespect. This is from a restorative justice facilitator who, because the schools and the restorative justice organization that based on the near training insights applied for funding and got some funding to put restorative justice practitioners into these schools to help facilitate this transition processes. And so this is one of the restorative justice practitioners speaking about the value of the trainings in reframing disruptive behaviors. So he's saying my gut feeling when I went into the neuroscience training was really like, okay, if kids are experiencing high levels of trauma, that makes sense, and that makes them less effective learners. That is news to no one. It seems like common sense, but so having some of the science now back it up was, I think, what I think most educators and people in behavioral health already knew is what was most valuable for me, and being able to take that information, disseminate it to some of the teachers we have that are old school, you know, that are the very old guard. So the very old guard here is discipline oriented and assuming disrespect. So, and then they use basically this biological knowledge also to bring arguments forward that if we know about kind of the biological effects of early life trauma and know that children are, particularly if they have experienced high levels of trauma, only to a certain extent able to adjust their behaviors, then the responsibility kind of falls onto the institutions to change rather than the children. So these are again some quotes that speak to this. When these kids are acting out, we're thinking they're wanting to do that. But if we change the paradigm to this is actually all we can do, it puts the responsibility back on us. We have a responsibility to help them develop social emotional competencies. And one of the neuroscience people from that organization even went that far that he said the inevitable conclusion of the science is compassion, which another restorative justice facilitator phrased like it's almost like an ethical issue. Like if we notice, how do we actually create the best possible environment to support resiliency? And this kind of arguments, because they're backed up with this biological knowledge claims, took quite fruit in this region and reached people that would often not listen to, let's say, social science arguments. So in this school district, they have very little money, like most schools have way too little money. So they went into very kind of easy to do practices, but because they had curricular freedom, they could implement them. They started doing talking circles, which is one of the key tools in restorative justice to facilitate community. So it's a very simple process of often in the first class of the day, it would start off with a talking circle where all the students and the teachers sit together, there's a talking piece, and then there's a simple question like, what did you do over the weekend? And people have an ability to connect. They institute calm rooms, which are rooms with women that are low light and soft toys, where if children are really upset in a fight, there's a place where they can go, where there's a person there, and they can just cool off. And the idea is that you can't expect children when they're upset to actually be able to talk about it. But then, again, biological argument, the nervous system takes time to reset, the stress hormones need to flood out of the body before executive function actually returns. They absolutely decided they would do no more suspension, no more expulsions. They had to change the report forms. So like if there was an incident, they built restorative justice informed forms where you would describe the incident and then agree on what measures would be taken for the reparation of harm. And as I said, they decided to bring in restorative justice facilitators, like apply for funding together to make it possible that they have these restorative justice facilitators in school to help them with this transition. And they took this, as I mentioned before, a whole community approach. So really everyone should be on board and not just the teaching staff, for example. And the focus then basically focused on building, maintaining, and repairing social relations. All right, so these are a few examples for how they experience these new craft practices and how they kind of affected the relationships between people. So this is a quote from the middle school principal. And so I've encouraged teachers to do circles, and it oftentimes leads to pretty heart-wrenching conversations and empathy development among students who are like, oh, I didn't know that. That's why so-and-so is always in front, you know? Because we'll say, how was your weekend? Or tell me one thing you're looking forward to over the holiday. And oftentimes there's nothing to look forward to. And those conversations do come up when you create a space for them. So this is kind of the building relationship parts, and then this elementary school principal speaks to how that then allows them to respond to situations where harm has occurred. The work with the restorative justice organization has just allowed us to, if something happens, it could be a conflict person to person, it could be in the classroom, it could be something going on in the school, in society, in our region, in the world, or whatever. Then RJ practices are just the avenue to be able to say, okay, let's circle up, let's talk. Everybody has a voice. There's a lot of good data that shows that this new approach has improved attendance, it's improved violent offenses, those types of things. And in fact, when the program got evaluated a couple of years later, they had much better graduation rates than they had before, so they're seeing actual data effects in terms of the performance of the students. Yeah, I'm going to give you this last example, and then I go to my conclusion slides. So here, the middle school principal talks about how she also changes how she speaks to students. So I do the flip the lid talk with the kids. Flip the lid. So there's this very simplified model of the brain that some of you might have heard of, where there's a reptile brain that's kind of here, that's our basic functions. Then there's a mammalian brain with the emotions. And then the fingers become the lid, which is executive function that kind of covers the other things over and allows us to interact more rationally with the world. And the flip the lid model is that when we get really upset, we flip our lid, and then kind of the mammalian, these are all very problematic terms, but the mammalian and the reptile brain is exposed, and we just act instead of kind of, you know, taking a breath and thinking. So she says, I do the flip the lid talk with the kids. You can do that easy with kids, right? You can show that. And I'm like, so you know, I can see you're not ready to have this conversation. Do you need some time, need some space? Yeah? And they'll be able to kind of self-regulate and come back down and notice when they're not so emotional. You're asking them to think about it and reflect, oh, what are the biological signs that I was escalating? My heart rate was really high, you know, I was red, or I was feeling nervous, I was twitching a lot. So you're kind of slowing down in the process, helping them to see what's going on with their own bodies. Like, oh yeah, what's your heart rate? You know, oh yeah, it's beating really pretty fast. I think you're probably upset, and you know what? I can't make any decisions when I'm upset or hungry or tired. And this is also one of the really interesting effects that we've been seeing through these trainings, that people start to think about their own experiences in their own bodies, in situations of stress, in relation to the children's experiences. So this kind of identification and compassion, and self-compassion as well, is part of this experience. So I will skip over the juvenile correction slides. We can talk about that in the discussion. Generally, so one important point, I'm going to summarize this briefly, is that when they're talking about kind of what kind of success, what means success when you're implementing this trauma-informed and restorative approach, is that they have very modest measures of success, but they're still really important. Like, for example, finding ways how a student who usually always kind of ran out of the school or was expelled, how the student can remain in the classroom without disrupting the others. So that's like a real step of success for these schools, or that's what they're thinking of when they're thinking about success. Because they're also shifting, in a sense, how they think about the baseline of what's going on with the children. And I just do want to read this quote. So many of the people who spoke to, that since they've been thinking about the neuroscience training, their view of the children has really changed. And so they're thinking about how for kids with a high ACE score, just showing up every single day to school demonstrates tremendous resilience. And so that this shift of thinking about, oh yeah, you just come to school every morning, right? That's easy. Shifts to kind of, okay, what are these children actually achieving on an everyday basis despite the things that have happened to them in their lives. So I think that's a really important point. In conclusion, the ACEs concept is becoming more widely used, both in the sciences and in different public sectors. Its current epigenetic instantiation allows actors who are actually interested in not only knowledge production, but also in improving the situation of children and youth who have experienced adversity to kind of use this concept to promote institutional change. Our case study points to some possible positive social outcomes, right? When biological knowledge has always an ambivalence there in terms of that can also lend itself for discrimination and stigmatization. Where they particularly focus on the reduction of punitive justice in school settings to support children who have either individually or structurally experienced violence and adversity. Yeah, essentially is that also this concept of resilience, and we can critically discuss also the concept of resilience, is located on the institutional level and on the community level. It's a community responsibility rather than just focus on the individual child. Practices always involve all children, so it's not about how can we just instantiate special practices for this one child, but how can we transform the community setting so that the children who have experienced adversity can thrive in the setting better. It is very important in our field site that this transformation was done together with restorative justice practitioners who come from this, also anti-racist work, who come from this real kind of social justice background, and who don't fall, when there's a chance that people might fall back onto very individualistic kind of measures, kind of widen it up again to a structural, systemic, community-oriented focus. And what we've seen, I couldn't speak about that today, but that, for example, in juvenile correctional settings, so in youth prisons, the integration of restorative justice and trauma-informed practices had also led to some principle questioning whether these institutions as such make sense. But of course, so what I'm not saying here is that these neuroscience trainings are a revolution and they will create positive change wherever, but rather that it's really situationally contingent what happens when you bring in these kinds of knowledges, and that it's really important how it's set up institutionally and what different actors come together to try to create change. Yes, that's my talk.
Thank you for the wonderful speech. Very interesting, inspiring, maybe in the last part for us that we work in the educational field, but also in the first part. To avoid the risk of running, we have time for collect a couple of questions, and after Professor Muller can ask quickly. So there are questions from the audience. Okay.
Yes, thank you. This is super interesting. To me, it seems that the effectiveness of those interventions depend on the reversibility of let's say the situation the kids have experienced. But it's not dependent on those experiences having a biological impact. So it could also be compatible with your first model that described the chronological trend in literature, where it was a more psychological situation. So what is it? Why is it that let's say the program needs biological reality for it to be effective? Is that the case? That's the first question.
I don't think that the program, like the interventions, need a biological basis, but I think, or we've seen it in the field side, that's what the actors in the field report, is that it made a huge difference for them to be able to make arguments based in natural science and materiality and biology in order to reach various actors that are important to make this change. So one of the restorative justice facilities talked, for example, about a physical education teacher, a Swartz teacher, who was kind of always against all this, like, soft stuff, right? The feel-good, we're nice with children approaches. But then when they talked about kind of the biological basis and how this can affect your nervous system and so on, he slowly started opening up. And then at some point he was like, oh yeah, I'm doing talking circles in my physical education class, right? So I do think that we absolutely have in the social sciences and the educational sciences and psychology absolutely enough evidence to know that these practices are successful. But I think what this kind of biological knowledge is bringing to the table is that they can enroll actors who otherwise would be resistant to these other types of knowledges.
The question?
How can you manage to bring all the people in fast rather and so it's necessary to bring in the whole community? Is it by their working time or how does it work? That they are interested and they are in the design model?
I think in the US it's slightly different because, for example, the bus driver is hired by the school. Like, it's a different type of organization. That the school's buses will pick up the children and so on. So some aspects of this story are very US specific, right? And would look very different if you implement it in a different national system and a different, even a different school district in the US. Yes, they organized it in the working time. It was part of regular ongoing education. How do you say this? Like continuous education programs. They gave teachers credit for that and also other people. I don't know exactly the incentive systems they put in place, but for the large part, they managed to include most of the community.
Okay. Thank you very much again.